Hello and welcome to Sophie & Co. I'm Sophie Shepard. Now, the deadliest Ebola epidemic ever witnessed has engulfed West Africa. As international action stalls, there are those who cannot stand aside. Médecins Sans Frontières is leading the battle against the killer virus. The organization's head has been to the affected areas and has seen the horror with her own eyes. Joining me today is Dr. Joan Liu.
Death is in the air in West Africa. Thousands are dying from Ebola. Thousands more are infected. While countries affected teeter on the verge of collapse, the global community only voices promises of international aid. When real action comes, will it be too little, too late? How can the virus be stopped? And what are the consequences of inaction?
Dr. Joan Liu, head of international NGO Médecins Sans Frontières, also known as Doctors Without Borders, welcome to the program. It's really great to have you with us today. Now, you recently arrived back from Liberia, which is ravaged by Ebola, but you also worked in other epidemic-affected areas like Haiti, for example. How is this one different?
Yeah, I think what is different in terms of West Africa and what's going on in the three mostly affected countries is the, I will say, the ravage of the illness. Basically, the Ebola epidemics has, I would say, affected the whole state infrastructure of the countries, but mostly in Liberia. So we don't have healthcare centers that are running properly in the city of Monrovia. People don't have access to basic healthcare because healthcare workers got infected and some of them have died. So that's how it has somehow affected the whole healthcare system. But what as well is different is the fact that we are dealing with a disease that right now is rapidly spreading. In the past, we used to deal with those kind of epidemic in some remote rural area. And then very quickly, it will die out on itself because the chain of transmission was really short. Now that it has reached a capital like Monrovia of 1.3 million people, the chain of transmission is much quicker. And then what we have seen recently, it's 1,000 new infected cases that is recorded over the last 2 weeks. Meaning that we have about 25% of the cases of Ebola that happened in the last 2 weeks, and we are dealing with this epidemic for the last 6 months.
So, Joan, is it fair to say that this Ebola epidemic is the gravest you have encountered as someone who is heading an NGO and is dealing with epidemics all the time?
I think with respect to hemorrhagic fever, this is the biggest and the most unprecedented Ebola epidemic that we have seen. So in terms of magnitude, in terms of spread, in terms of people being infected, and the fact that we are really right now, we'll say, facing the unknowns of how to tackle at best this epidemic.
Mm-hmm. Now, I saw videos of you wearing protective gear and all. How worried were you about actually being infected? Were you scared?
Well, I think that I think it's a fair question, and I think that everyone who goes in any Ebola environment has to, I would say, overcome their own fear. But I think it's the same thing when we go to any other, I would say, context where you are risking your life. I would say the main difference that I see is when you are in a country like South Sudan or Central African Republic, you can see some firing, and at one point there's a pause in terms of firing. What happened in country with Ebola is there's no downtime. You are somehow always exposed. And that can be really, really, I would say, straining on the mental.
But is there any way a doctor who is there to save people can protect themselves and be sure that he's not affected?
There is some basic rules that needs to be in terms of protection. When you are in Ebola management centers, we have very strict rules in terms of how the personnel needs to protect themselves. And this is why we wear what we call those protective personal Ebola gear, and so there's a full routine how to put on the equipment. There's a full routine how to remove it in many steps. And the way we're working in MSF is we have basically a coach, a dresser coach, who gives you order to make sure that you don't miss one step and you don't infect yourself while you're undressing. So if you are following that, you're fine. I think the other, I would say, challenge is when you are in the community and you will do some care in the community, is how much you should protect yourself. But the reality is, A, someone is not infected until he has symptoms, and B, it's contagious via body fluids, meaning that if you're not in contact with body fluids, you will not get the illness. So when we talk about the body fluids, we talk about if someone has some ejection from the bodies, from so vomitus or
sneezing,
diarrhea,
vomiting, coughing,
or sweat. Coughing, but you need body fluids, yes.
But here's another question, which, from my understanding, is another huge problem with tackling the disease. Did you feel like the people there trusted you? How desperate did you feel they were for your help?
I think that Ebola is always a challenge wherever it comes. And this one has been even more challenging because it spread so quickly. And there is like 3 ways in intervening with Ebola. There's what I call the 3 pillars of intervention. The first one is the community mobilization and education, telling them what is the symptom, when to do consultation, and as well to use the universal precaution of hand washing regularly. The second pillar is in terms of surveillance, getting the data to find out about the magnitude, and as well working on breaking the chain of transmission, which means doing the contact tracing of people who have been in contact with someone infected, making sure that we have safe burials to avoid more contamination. And the third pillar, it's in terms of caring for patients with Ebola in isolation center. And so that's how we need to respond to it. What is going on right now, of all those 3 pillars, we haven't done enough. And the community mobilization needs to be done hand in hand. And it's with the community mobilization and education that we'll get acceptance. And so we had our times of challenges in some areas.
But I guess what I'm asking is, do you still see situations in countries like Liberia where shamans, for example, and the likes of shamans are more respected than educated doctors, the conventional doctors?
Right. This is not something that I saw firsthand. I have heard some stories about that, never been able to verify it. But I think that this is something somehow that we need to respect. And but I think that right now there's I would say, a good understanding of what's going on to a certain extent. There's still a lot of fears. And I would say now our challenge is to, I would say, translate this fear into vigilance and not panic. Community acceptance is key. Talking to the elders, the leaders of a community or prefecture is key. And this is what we have done. And in some places where initially we were rejected, today people don't want us to leave.
Mm-hmm. Now, here's some measures that some countries are introducing. For example, Sierra Leone introducing prison sentences for people who hide their sick relatives. Is that likely to help, in your opinion?
I think that those kind of measures are very, I would say, really tough decision, and it's really difficult to predict how it will unfold and how it may create more panics. We have a lot of reservation in those kind of measures. We have shared our concern, but as well we respect the government decision.
But also, why do you think some are so reluctant to send their sick ones to the hospital? Why are they prone to hide them more than, make them get some help?
I think if people realize this is the last moment of a loved one, they want to accompany this person. And then having them doing that by themselves in the places where you have only people in spacesuit around might be something difficult. And this is why we are really trying in our isolation center to make it more human and give some sort of an access to the family members. These are all hypotheses.
Now, you also have spoken of the total collapse of infrastructure and health systems in affected states. How is it possible to get that under control?
Well, I think that right now it's a huge task, because when you face an Ebola epidemic, the people who were at the beginning, at the forefront, are really the health personnel. And we often see health personnel being infected, some of them will die, and some of them will infect other people and their patients in centers. And so this is why we had a collapse of healthcare structure. So today we need to reopen healthcare center with good infection control, train the health personnel to protect themselves. And this is a huge task, because right now, for example, in Monrovia, we don't have any of the big hospitals open and running. And we've seen so many dramatic, I would say, stories, like the one of having half a dozen, pregnant women one day walking around Monrovia, the capital of Liberia, looking for a safe place to deliver, and couldn't find any places, and ended up being coming at our Ebola management center at the end of the day. And by the time they reach us, the baby was dead. So this is really, I would say, a dramatic situation, and we need to restore basic healthcare access.
Lots to be done there, Joanne. All right, we're going to take a short break right now. When we'll come back, we'll continue to talk to Dr. Joanne Liu, head of Médecins Sans Frontières, about the bigger dangers the deadly Ebola epidemic poses to world security. Stay with us. And we're back with Dr. Joanne Liu, head of international NGO Médecins Sans Frontières. So, Joanne, I'm just going to show our viewers a map so they have a clear idea of what I'm talking about. The virus has spread from rural areas to some of Africa's biggest cities. Now, there were Ebola epidemics in 95, in 2000, 2003, 2007. Why has this one become worse?
Well, this Ebola epidemic has become worse because we think, and this is all hypothesis, but because in the fact it was concentrated in a rural area, where in a remote village, where the chain of transmission will die out very quickly because people were not mobile, it was a small village, so the chain of transmission stopped readily. Now that you have reached a big city where there's a lot of people, a dense population, and I would say living of conditions that are as well difficult in terms of water and sanitation, then the chain of transmission is much, much faster. And actually, we don't have a modeling how to, I would say, forecast figures right now.
But another thing is that, like you say, the chain of transmission is pretty fast. And if we look at the map of the Ebola outbreak, now some countries are seriously affected, and then you have the others that are clear of the disease. How does that work? Why is that?
Well, the thing is, right now it's affecting three major countries, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. We have to appreciate that the epidemic's at different stages in the different countries. In Guinea, we are at the third peak of cases since March. In Sierra Leone, we're still seeing growing numbers of cases. And the reality, we don't have a full visibility on the number of cases. We know that there is a lot of death in the communities. And in Liberia, we have a little bit more, I would say, visibility. But again, what we know is there's an acceleration in chain of transmission. We had a lot of cases over the last few weeks. About the other countries around, there's might be some rumors, we don't know. We ask people to be vigilant, to really scale up in terms of education of their healthcare worker, and to be prepared if ever it happens. So the reality is, it reminds me a little bit of what happened in Haiti with cholera. If you have a country that has a medical infrastructure that is, I would say, weak for different reasons, when comes an epidemic of that high level of contagiosity, it somehow, I would say, moved really fast. And so this is most likely what is happening in West Africa.
Now, the bigger question is, of course, I've heard you address the United Nations where you said that the world has lost the fight against Ebola. Why do you believe that?
So why I did that, I said the world is losing the battle against Ebola, is the fact that we've been working in West Africa for the last 6 months. We've been opening Ebola management centers. We have 5 of them. We have 2,000 staff in the ground. And every day for the last many weeks, we have to turn back patients home that have Ebola because we don't have enough isolation beds in our center. Every day, we are picking up dead body at our doorsteps because the families are coming and letting their loved one in at our doorstep because they want us to care safely about their bodies. So this is why we say we're losing the battle. This should not happen. People should be able to consult and have access to a bed in isolation when they are infected. And if they have to do the last journey, they should be able to do it with dignity. And this is not happening.
Now, John, if you turn on any news station around the world, the headlines are running Ukraine and ISIS as their first stories. Do you believe Ebola is a greater international threat?
I don't like to, I would say, compare different contexts, but I really do think that today the Ebola epidemic is an international concern, as has been called by WHO on August 8th, and I think it's everyone's business. If we don't contain the Ebola epidemic in the most concerned countries or regionally, it will have a major impact in terms of economy, in terms of human life loss, and we were going to pay, I would say, the cost of that for years to come. So I really urge all the state members of the world to consider to come up and bring a hand in the field. I really do think as well that it's really strange that today the know-how how to tackle an Ebola epidemic is in the hand of an international private organization. I think every nation should develop a know-how how to deal with a highly contagious disease.
But why do you think that people aren't giving, the international community isn't giving enough to battle this disease if it's that grave? Why is that?
I think it's the reality is, as you said, rightly so, there are many crises in the world right now. I think that people are having difficulty to pay attention to all the crises. But I think as well, it's difficult to get a reality check about what is the magnitude of the epidemic when we just take some of the cold figures of saying, oh, 4,700 people infected, about half of them died. Well, compared to other, I would say, contexts, is it that bad? But the reality is this is only the tip of the iceberg. First of all, we know that the figures are underestimated. We think we have only 20% visibility on the number of cases. We know the potential of this Ebola epidemic to the rest of the African continent. And we know as well that a biologic threat like Ebola is something that will probably come again, and everybody should develop a know-how how to deal with it.
John Ashton, he's a senior UK health official. He condemned the pharmaceutical industry for not caring about Ebola since the potential market for a vaccine is not profitable or profitable enough. Is that the case?
There's always this sort of issue about research and development on new vaccine or new treatment. I think that this is something that we can overcome. I think we need to put pressure on pharmaceutical companies to make sure that what will be developed, and I think right now a vaccine is key to be developed as soon as possible. It needs to be tested to make sure it's safe and it's efficient. But the other thing is, once we know that it is that good, we have to make sure that it's going to be available and there's a production line. And so the question about international intellectual property should not be an obstacle for accessibility to this vaccine to come.
Now, the current outbreak is happening in a volatile region that has seen the rise of terror like Boko Haram. And back in '92, there was a Japanese cult group as well that collected samples of the Ebola virus from Africa, allegedly planning to use it in a terror attack. Now, does Ebola pose a potential terror risk? And I mean, I'm trying to figure out, is that going to speed up this search for an effective antidote?
Yeah, I think that everybody has different scenario, and I would say conspiracy or plot scenario in their mind. I think it's very difficult for me as a medical doctor to position myself on it. But the reality is my take on this is that I think that there's going to be other, I would say, biological disease that are highly infectious that probably will spread to other countries in the future. And I would say getting a know-how how to deal with that is paramount.
Mm-hmm. But I guess what I'm trying to ask is that how close are we to a vaccine as of right now? I know that back in 2010, the U.S. Department of Defense signed a $140 million contract with a company called Techmira to develop the Ebola treatment. Are we any close now?
I think that right now there's a huge momentum in terms of research and development on a vaccine. I think there's different companies are working on a prototype, so I'm pretty hopeful that something will be tested pretty soon. And again, I think it's not a question of finding the vaccine, but it's to make sure that it's safe and efficient, and after that, it is accessible.
Mm-hmm. Just a few more questions about the ways of tackling the things. For example, from his side, President Obama has indicated he is prepared to send troops to help combat the outbreak. How can soldiers help in this kind of situation?
I think what in my UN remark, one of the things I said is the fact that we need civilian or military asset with a good chain of command that can deploy rapidly in a big number and have discipline, because that's what it needs to treat and care for Ebola patients. And so I think that somehow they are responding to one of our appeal. And the reality is when we see, I would say, natural disaster, we never question when some army comes and deploy. We have a disaster response, and often it's the military, and they often do a fairly good job.
But if we look at things the way they are right now, what are the prospects? What's going to happen? Is it going to get any worse? Is it going to get better?
I wish I could answer you. And as I said at the beginning of my interview, we are on our in uncharted waters. We are in the unknown, and it's difficult. But the thing that I know is the fact that if we don't deploy right now more assets, more workforce, and more that will allow to have more isolation bed for infected patients, we will not be able to control and contain this epidemic. And so every day that we wait, it's lost life, but in addition, it complexifies how we need to deploy in terms of response. Because we know that every 3 weeks, more or less, the number of cases are doubling. So it's exponential.
John, thank you so much for this wonderful insight. Very interesting, very helpful. I do agree the whole world should reunite to fight and contain this horrific epidemic. Thanks a lot for what you're doing to help that. We're talking to Dr. Joan Liu, who is the head of the international NGO Médecins Sans Frontières, also known as Doctors Without Borders. We were talking about the Ebola epidemic, the last outbreak, what can be done to contain it, and how the international community should pay more attention to grave issues like Ebola. That's it for this edition of Sophie & Co, and I will see you next time. Stay with us.